Good evening. I might ask people to start coming forward, please. This is an interesting mic, isn't it? Very interesting mic. If people could come forward, please, that'd be great. Don't be shy. It's all good. Is Tony around? Where's Tony? Yeah. Righto. Well, good evening, everyone. And I should start by saying to Tony Shepherd that we have established an oration in your name, which means you have to listen to at least the introductory speeches. And so I will start by acknowledging country and just acknowledging that we are all so lucky to be Australian. And I think the events of the last month and a half have reminded us all how difficult it is in different parts of the world and how fragile our social cohesion can be here in this country, but that we have been the most successful multicultural country on earth, and that remains always a very fragile position for our country, and we always have to work so hard to maintain our hard-won diversity and respect for different opinions. And I hope you'll all agree with me that being Australian is the most wonderful gift that we all share. And the point of this oration tonight is to provide a distinguished person with an opportunity to say something about our country's future and to talk about public policy from a business perspective. Because there are very few opportunities in Australia's public life for people who are distinguished, who have experience in business, to say something about the country's future. And the point of this oration was to acknowledge the great contribution of Tony Shepherd, someone who has made it in business but has spent a lot of time being prepared to go into the arena and to take a position and to have a view about the country's future. And that is the essence of this, is we want to encourage people to come into the arena and to have their say, not about politics, but about policy. And so I want to thank the NAB and Phil Cronican very much for their tremendous support of this venture over many years. And I'm going to be your Master of Ceremonies. I should say that the bathrooms are that way and to the right. If there are any other administrative issues, just let me know. But I think that's all I need to say right now. But I will now hand over to Tony. Before doing so, I do just want to say that it is a really great pleasure for me to be here tonight to be associated with my former boss, Jennifer Westacott, who's one of the best people I've known. And Jennifer and Tony have one great thing in common, that they are both fantastic patriots. And I will now hand over to Tony to make some opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And as you all know, Andrew is probably the most active person in the Australian Senate on a constructive basis. So well done, and we're lucky to have you. Anyway, welcome everybody. It's lovely to have you here. You're an eclectic bunch, but I think we have a lot in common. There may be things we disagree in, but I think we all have a lot in common, and we are really concerned as to where Australia is heading economically and socially, and in many other factors that are important to our quality of life. And so that is, I think, the shared concern, and I think this is why I'm so proud to have this oration named after me. Well, Andrew was the initiator of the oration, and it's our fifth oration tonight. And as he said, the purpose in establishing it was that encouraging business, small, medium and large, to speak out on those policies that affect their capacity to add to our economy and their capacity to service the community. And at times we're a bit shy here. We're scared that we'll get retribution from the government of the day and what have you. Well, yeah, sometimes that does happen, but generally speaking, you earn respect if you do it properly and sensibly. You actually earn respect rather than getting punished for doing it. So that's something. So I'm glad to see there are business associations here that represent the views of their members, which is perfect. We're privileged tonight to have as our orator my good friend and former colleague Jennifer Westacott, who recently retired after many years as CEO of the Business Council of Australia. Probably one of the toughest jobs in Australia, frankly. Yeah, but she's bounced back pretty full of veins, which is good. And I was president of the Business Council from November 2011 to March 2014 through the Gillard and Rudd governments. Yeah, that was really easy. Not. Jennifer taught me a lot, and I learnt a lot out from her. But we managed to sort of maintain our line, and we worked very cooperatively with the other business groups, like COSBOA, AIG, Minerals Council, to just keep the brakes on the worst excesses of those two governments. And when we're talking excesses, we're talking real excesses. And Jennifer proved to be, a highly intelligent, highly engaged CEO. She taught me a lesson in terms of, well, at least always be courteous when you're criticising. Something I had to learn, coming from the School of Hard Knocks, courtesy wasn't big. Anyway, I learnt a lot from Jennifer, but even though she's always courteous and right to the point, she always maintains the position, the right position. She puts a position firmly, logically, based by facts. And that is the best way of getting the community on side and sometimes influencing the government to make the right decision. So we're very, very happy to have her here tonight. And in terms of Phil Cronican, welcome and thank you to Phil for hosting this yet again. And as I always say, I dealt with a lot of bankers over a lot of years in business, and Phil Cronican is right up there, I think, is the best or one of the best of them I've ever dealt with in business. And you don't often say that about a banker, do you? Well, Phil is the exception that proves the rule, and the successes the business he's run it shows you that capacity is extremely valuable. So thank you again, Phil, and it's always a delight to see you. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer Westacott.
Now, but before we do that, this is my first year emceeing this event, and I'm going to be sacked from emceeing it next year because I neglected to welcome our host, Phil Cronican, who's going to welcome us all tonight. So thank you very much, Phil Cronican.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Tony, and thanks everyone for coming along, because I'd just like to reiterate the view about the importance of public debate on policy issues. And long in my deep dark past, even before I was a banker, I was a policy economist, and I know the importance of sound policy. So it is important that we do this work. I do want to welcome everyone here to NAB's headquarters, which we opened in the middle of COVID, so we didn't get a lot of use for the first 3 or 4 months, but we were able, I think, to host the second or third, I think the third event. Tony Shepherd Oration was hosted here. Our building is on Gadigal land, and just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I think in light of the recent events, it's given us all good pause, and I'll come back to the issue about Indigenous recognition in a few minutes. It's great that this event continues to attract interest, and very pleased to see the coverage in the media today about the comments, Jennifer, that you're about to make. I think it shows the public interest. Andrew, thank you for your unrelenting interest in promoting policy as opposed to politics. I think you earn a lot of respect from a lot of people in this room for that. And Tony, we've known each other for a long time now, but you've just made such great contributions over the years, wherever you've turned your mind, be it in the businesses you ran, your time at the Business Council, and more recently getting the GWS as far as they've gone. So. But look, in my 40-odd years in business, I can't think of a time when the challenges and opportunities that face Australia require us to have this dialogue between public and private sectors. You know, the nature of the issues that are ahead of us aren't going to be solved by political position taking. They're going to be solved by people really focusing in on the substance of the issues and focusing on the policy responses that they require. And I just want to touch briefly on three of those. Three things that will be important for a growing Australian and thriving Australian society. And the first of those is the climate adjustment. Tony's already made mention of that one. Public policy settings to guide Australia's transition were late coming, but need to be better cemented in place. And we know that we're not building enough renewable energy capacity to make the transition that we need. We also we know that the economy is only going to survive or thrive if we think more broadly than just a compliance approach towards net zero. And we here at NAB, we sponsored a piece of work with Deloitte during the year, which focused in on the fact that it's one thing to achieve net zero within our domestic economy, but of course so much of our export industry is based on exporting energy to other countries. And if the world does make its transition to net zero, we're not going to have that export earnings from coal, from gas, from other forms of energy, and we need to be thinking more proactively about how we replace those export industries as well. So that's something that we think is big, and it's going to require business and governments collectively to work together so that we can speed up approval times, unleash investment, get things built more economically, more quickly. That's the only way we're going to make that transition. The second one is this challenge around the housing crisis, and it's an issue that is real. We know that migration is a contributing factor to it, but we have a growing population no matter what. And we know that we don't build enough housing in Australia to meet the need. Clearly, as a bank, we've got an important role to play, but again, it comes down to issues around zoning, planning permissions, density, and getting construction work to be quicker, cheaper, and deliver housing on a more affordable basis than we currently have. And that's going to require the complex issue of three levels of government and business working together. So not a trivial issue, but a very, very important one. And then lastly, I just want to touch briefly on the ongoing and remaining issue of inclusion and well-being of Indigenous Australia. At NAB here, we did support the Yes campaign, and it was based on our belief that building societal cohesion is also an important part, because we've got to build a community in which people feel connected. And I've been fortunate enough in my time here as chair at NAB to spend a lot of time outside of Sydney and Melbourne, out in places where our communities actually operate. And last year we took the whole board up to the Northern Territory, met with land councils, Indigenous leaders, but also with Indigenous business bankers. And it's important. We see a lot of opportunity and a lot of existing activity where Indigenous businesses are thriving, albeit small. And we're going to continue that. We've just signed up a new Reconciliation Action Plan, and as part of that, we're committing to over $1 billion of lending to Indigenous business over the next 3 years. And that's part of what we're trying to do from a grassroots level of ensuring that the momentum is not lost and that we do take an opportunity to better integrate Indigenous communities into mainstream Australia. So to that end, I'd just like to close off by again welcoming you, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here tonight, but no greater pleasure, Jennifer, than to have you here to give the oration. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Phil, thank you, Tony, and thank you to Senator Andrew Bragg. I'm truly honoured to be giving this speech in Tony's name, a tremendous friend of mine, a mentor, and I'm sure an inspiration to all of us in the room tonight. Tony is a person who, like me, grew up in an Australia where if you worked hard and you did your job, things just seemed to get better. Each year, many people felt they were getting ahead. He and I both spent our formative years in a time when governments took bold choices and made courageous decisions. Businesses, communities and families took risks, they invested, they responded to those government signals. Each year the country seemed to get ahead. But now I think we are at the precipice of a different, more uncertain era. A time when we are at risk of being the first generation of Australians to bequeath the next generation lower living standards. A time when our children and grandchildren can no longer take for granted the things that have underpinned our cohesive society and our prosperity, affordable and secure housing, growing wages, long-term and successful, profitable businesses across the economy who are able to compete in a complex world rather than the few standouts who are carrying the country. High quality and accessible services, reliable and affordable energy, an adequate safety net for the most vulnerable, infrastructure that gets us and our products from A to B without congestion, and an open, diverse and tolerant society. I believe a decade of policy inertia has left Australia in a dangerous position where we are sleepwalking into lower living standards, a position where we risk being economically and strategically vulnerable. And this was one of the main warnings the Business Council sounded in the final report I led called Seize the Moment. And the work aligns with the ambition of tonight's Shepherd Oration, which is dedicated to the simple proposition that business is central to our economy and has an important voice in policy formulation. Of course, it's always worthwhile to remind ourselves who is business. Well, it's made up of mum and dad shareholders, the super funds where every Australian's future is invested, customers, suppliers, and employees like the people who work at Bunnings, Woolies or NAB, serving the communities that they're part of. This is who business represents when it advocates for good policy. Unfortunately, I see the anti-business agenda creeping back into our national discourse, particularly against big business. And I simply say this, be very careful what you wish for. An attack on business is an attack on all of us. Unprofitable businesses lead to lower wages, lower employment, and a weaker country. So let me go through what I think is needed to turn the country around and to channel Tony and my fundamental belief that it's all about the fundamentals. The fundamentals that drive a strong and more resilient economy, the fundamentals that drive a fairer, more secure country, and the fundamentals that drive a more respectful and courteous society that allows debates to be had in our society to move forward. To paraphrase from former President Bill Clinton, it's the fundamentals, stupid, and it's definitely the economy, stupid. When people read Seize the Moment and our scorecard of where we are as a nation, many commented, "I did not know that," and they were alarmed. So let me go through a quick snapshot. You can't begin a national scorecard without noting our very low unemployment rate, but wages are not growing fast enough over the long term. The data that came out a couple of weeks ago was excellent. The question is, can you sustain it? Wages grew about $2,100 a year in the last decade, but the decade before that, they were growing by $2,600 a year. That money matters to people. Economic growth is too slow, a pretty fundamental. If the economy was growing at its long-run average of 3.3% instead of the 2.3% it's grown over the last decade, it would be $200 billion bigger, there would be an extra $50 billion in tax revenue, and on average, Australians would be $7,000 a year better off, and that would grow each year. Our economy is too narrow. Our top 12 companies pay around 35% of all company tax. Just 6 products and services make up 60% of the country's exports. Nearly half of our products are carbon intensive in a world that is rapidly decarbonising. Our education standards continue to fall, yet we've increased spending dramatically. We've slipped from 4th in the OECD to 16th. In science, we're down from 8 to 17. In maths, we've fallen from 11 to 29. So on the fundamental building block of a progressive society, that is its educated citizens, we're falling behind. When it comes to disadvantage, 1.2 million Australians, or 1 in 20 people, are experiencing deep social exclusion. On home ownership, the average house value is now 7 times average incomes. In the 1990s, it was 4 times. On debt, we are on track to be $1 trillion in debt, and that's not counting the state debt. We do recognise that for the first time in 15 years, the budget is back in surplus, which is a significant achievement. But the intergenerational report tells us that we have to find an extra $140 billion a year to pay for just 5 things: the NDIS, the interest payments on the debt, defence, aged care and health. So we're not even talking about funding infrastructure and education, the big levers to grow the economy. So it's any wonder that we're poised to slip from the world's 13th largest economy to the 21st by 2050. So why is this so? Well, the past decade has seen the lowest rate of productivity growth in 60 years. Economic fundamental. You can't get higher wages if you don't drive higher productivity. Don't take my word for it. Take every piece of economic analysis from the Treasury and the Productivity Commission for the last 50 years. It's not a philosophy, it's a fact. Business investment are near 30-year lows as a share of GDP. Sure, it's ticked up recently and that's welcome news, like wages, but the question is, have we got the policy settings to sustain it? Economic fundamental. You can't get productivity if you don't drive innovation and find more efficient ways of doing things. And you can't get innovation if you don't invest. And you can't get investment if you can't compete. In the last 2 decades, we've fallen from 4th to 19th place in the world competitiveness rankings. Our tax system in particular is uncompetitive. Economic fundamental. Taxes matter in decision making, particularly for global companies who've got choices about where they invest. So it's pretty clear that our fundamentals are not in good shape, yet the world is fundamentally changing around us. Technology, digitisation, happening at an incredibly fast pace, but opening up big opportunities. We're sitting on the doorstep of the biggest middle class in history, huge opportunities. The world is increasingly volatile and continues to test our resilience. But despite this uncertainty, other countries are getting on and doing things. We are taking too long. We do have time to turn the ship, but turn it we must. We have all the ingredients to become the frontier economy and the frontier society. But the question is this: will we overcome inertia and inaction and seize the moment? So what do we need to do to get traction on the fundamentals? Seize the moment document, and my personal belief is we need 6 shifts. The first of those is the diversification of the economy. We need to move from a narrow cast economy to a more resilient and diversified one. Now, this is not about old-fashioned industry subsidies and protectionism. It's about unleashing the potential of what we're already good at, what we should be good at, and what we must be good at. Without labouring the point, before you do industry policy, you do need to double down on the fundamentals: tax, competitiveness, ease of doing business. But there are some important steps we could take to diversify the economy. First of all, though, we need to support the industries where we currently excel: mining, resources, agriculture, finance. And through innovation and investment, we need to move up those value chains to produce premium products at premium prices. This means driving more R&D, removing the regulatory barriers to expand those industries and not make it harder to do things. Then there are the industries where we have the potential to tap into the world's biggest supply chains: advanced manufacturing, quantum, space, defence, the circular economy, semiconducting, medical devices, vaccine production. So how do we do this? Well, I'm a big fan of national precincts, and I see this all around the world, where people come together, share ideas and resources, and collaborate to get industries up at scale. This is not about government subsidies, it's about coordination for impact. We should be looking at doubling down on the big precincts like Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, Western Sydney, the Illawarra and the Hunter, and Lot 14 in South Australia. There cannot be more than 10, and there's currently about 150, because they have to be globally significant and they have to be at scale. And they have to be anchored with a tripartite arrangement between business, academia and government, as are the successful models in other countries. But industry strengthening and industry formation will require more than just national precincts. Targeted industry policy, proper concierging of global businesses into Australia, a long hard look at regulatory settings, and in some cases we will need to co-invest in some things to get them at scale, such as vaccine production. But it's absolutely crucial that industry policy not be confined to decarbonisation, and successful industry policy requires us to stay in the centre lane on energy and climate policy. We need a carefully calibrated decarbonisation of the economy based on technology realism, technology neutrality, technology readiness, and an underpinning commitment to affordability and reliability. Otherwise, we will lose the social licence to stay with the energy transition. Oh, and one more fundamental on energy: you cannot remove energy sources until you've replaced energy sources. Apologies for being basic. But there is an area of industry policy that's contested, but we do need to be willing to talk about it, and that's about sovereign capability. Having seen up close and personal the problems with supply chains during the pandemic and global conflicts, such as almost running out of AdBlue, we do need to be willing to ask ourselves, can we afford not to do some things in this country? I would put semiconducting, vaccine production and some medicine production at the top of the list. Bottom line on industry policy, get the fundamentals right. Number 2, protect the core. Number 3, play to our strengths. And that is a profoundly different course of action to protecting failing industries. The second of our shifts is about people and capabilities. I keep stressing it's going to be the people, the skills and capabilities of our people that define whether we can be a more successful country. And it will define whether or not we can strengthen existing industries and tap into new ones. Unleashing the potential of our people starts with addressing all aspects of our education and migration systems. If I turn to early childhood and the secondary education system first, we must listen to the evidence that we need a comprehensive early childhood system in this country, not an array of childcare, early childhood and preschool systems with different standards across different states. The victims of this schmozzle are young children, particularly disadvantaged kids who miss out on those essential building blocks. So let's establish a universal early childhood model with a proper guarantee that can be adequately funded, that's properly means tested, and where the cost doesn't get away from us. Next, let's get serious about school education, something we continue to fail at. Why? Because we are forgetting the fundamentals. The fundamentals of numeracy, literacy, and digital competence, phonics, autonomy for principals, decent careers advice, making it easier for teachers to increase their skills and pay them accordingly, and regarding the teaching profession with the status and the authority it deserves. These are the inspiration and mentors for many young children. Why aren't we rewarding and encouraging them? On principal autonomy, are we doing enough to allow principals to attract the people they need for the circumstances that are operating in their schools? Why are we still having ideological debates about phonics and about the fundamental teaching methodologies for numeracy and literacy? Hands up those in the room who are happy that our kids are leaving school having failed maths or not meeting basic literacy standards or lacking the skills to equip them for a modern digital economy. I'm not. How do we feel about an assessment system that says everybody is doing okay? Nobody is doing exceptionally and nobody is doing really badly. This is a great unfairness to children. We owe it to children to tell them when they are brilliant, and we owe it to children to help them when they are struggling so they can realise their full potential. Every child has a gift, every child has potential, but realising that sometimes requires honest and difficult conversations. Why are we still having careers advisors who are not supported by proper careers advice infrastructure, who are not tapped into industry? Why aren't we moving to regional or specialised careers hubs across the country to make it easier for industry to articulate their needs? And why don't we recognise that students leave school with more than a mark? They leave with a set of capabilities, communications, team building, work-related skills. Why can't we properly accredit that? Why can't we put it on a digital record? Why can't we recognise work and volunteering? And then on the tertiary system, we need to deal with this distorted funding model that pushes so many students to go to university when many of them would be better not to. Why can't we have a system that makes it more easy to blend vet and higher education? Why can't we allow students to choose credentials from areas other than their degree? Why don't we make it easier for them to work and learn at the same time, recognising that the courses their employer provides should be part of the skills system? Why aren't we looking at things like micro-credentials so people can learn for the rest of their lives? Why aren't we allowing people to stack those courses? Now, none of this is easy, and that's why it hasn't been done. But we do have these big reviews underway in government, and I really hope they deliver a system that's more oriented towards students and employers. But before I turn briefly to migration, I want to state these fundamentals. We have a sovereign responsibility to skill our citizens. We have a sovereign responsibility to unleash the potential of all of our citizens. And we have a sovereign responsibility to allow people to stay working all their lives through a system that responds to change. We cannot continue with this flawed system where many people who are capable of working don't, where migrants have qualifications that are not recognised, and where people with potential are unable to access education because of equity issues. Briefly to migration, we must start by improving the community's confidence in the migration programs and make sure that it has integrity and purpose. Australians want migration. When the BCA surveyed Australians, 2/3 of people want well-managed migration, but they do want to see the integrity back in the system. Secondly, we need to get the permanent settings right, focusing on skills, not occupation lists, which are going to be out of date before they've left the printer. Thirdly, our temporary migration settings must be sustainable. They need to synergise with our wider policy trajectories. They have to be realistic, they have to be deliberative, and we need to be precise about the numbers because many of these temporary migrants are students, and we know that the vast majority of them do not stay in Australia. But as Phil said, we have to have regard to the pressure on our housing system and get our planning, infrastructure systems working together so that the country thrives through population growth. But make no mistake, well-managed migration is in our national interest. If I turn to the third shift we need to make, and that's for us to remain an outward-looking country and pursue trade agreements and international partnerships. Australia is not the United States. We are not the biggest economy in the world. We cannot afford to become insular and isolated. So we have to marry up the diversification of our economy with tapping into the world's biggest supply chains, particularly in that area of Southeast Asia. We have to position ourselves as a trusted middle power, actively participating in the big multilateral agreements. We need to do more with our free trade agreements as we move towards things like cooperation agreements rather than just simply a list of removing tariffs. If I turn to the fourth and fifth shifts, because they go in hand, a strong private sector and a more competitive and productive economy. I'm always astounded when people react badly to the idea of unleashing the private sector as if it's a bad thing. It's the private sector that generates 80% of tax revenues in this country. It's the private sector that overwhelmingly drives innovation. It's the private sector that faces the world. Governments don't trade, businesses trade. It's the private sector that employs 6 out of 7 working Australians. It's the private sector we have to unleash, not in an uncontrolled way, but in a way that's about unleashing innovation, potential, ideas and expansion. And we have to do this by becoming more competitive. We have to face into the fact that our tax system is too high and our company tax rate is too high. We must also face the fundamental that it is fundamentally too hard to do business in Australia. Too many little things stand in the way. I've been calling for years for an ease of doing business agenda. It's a no-brainer, and it should start with the planning system. We want our critical minerals and renewable energy projects to get going. We want our housing system to be solved, but we won't face into the fact that it just takes too long to get things approved and get them off the ground. And in addition to fixing our planning system, simple things that we can do to make ourselves more competitive. Streamline licensing, progress the single trade window for export, look at retail trading hours, an absolute schmozzle across the Federation. And of course it would be remiss of me, notwithstanding I'm no longer at the BCA, but I still fundamentally believe this, to not argue that we must have an industrial relations system that drives collaboration and innovation. My criticism of what is before us now is that it will create rigidity and friction and it will not lead to a more competitive and productive system. My fundamental concern is that it will hurt workers and it will hurt the most vulnerable workers. And the last of our big shifts, good government. I don't accept the neoconservative line that government is just bad. Governments are crucial anchors and facilitators. They are vital to delivering services, setting the tone for society and managing our strategic objectives. So I'm a fan of government, not big government, but good government. And part of good government is addressing runaway spending. Despite the best will in the world, the NDIS fits into this category. We need bipartisanship to rein it back in. Good government also needs to use technology to improve productivity and service delivery, such as education and health and human services. Why are nurses still spending around 50% of their time doing paperwork instead of attending to high needs patients? And good government means having the tough conversations about who pays for what, something that Tony's Commission of Audit endeavoured to do. But the journey to good government begins by asking the questions about the role of government. Why are they doing something? Can it be done more effectively? And is it meeting the needs of consumers? And on the last one, I think the answer is very often not. So these are the 6 big shifts that I think are going to drive the next wave of prosperity. I don't believe those are fundamental shifts that should be contested. People might contest the detailed policy, but they are the fundamentals that will secure our economic future. But none of this can be done if we don't revisit the fundamentals of the way we do policy centrism, good policy process and a climate where ideas can flourish. So if I turn to centrism in the middle class, I don't believe Australians want radical agendas on either side of the political spectrum. If you look back at our most successful governments, long-serving prime ministers and governments, Hawke and Keating, Howard and Costello and Menzies, they were the governments of centrism. They were governments that pretty much everyone could relate to. They focused on competence. They focused on big reform, but packaged in a way that was pragmatic, sensible and focused on the centre. And that centre is the middle class of Australia. And I believe this group of people have been abandoned. They are the people who work hard every day. They are the people who often spend hours travelling in Brisbane and Melbourne and Sydney. They are our essential workers, the nurses, the teachers, the truck drivers, the cleaners, the construction workers, the baggage handlers, the supermarket workers, the bank workers. And we found out during COVID just how important they are, and we have abandoned them. I am calling for us to think about why we continue to abandon the middle class of Australia. More than 80 years has passed, and we still forget the people that Menzies so precisely described as the backbone of the country. And I believe these forgotten Australians feel very angry, and they are beginning to build a tremendous resentment about the way they feel estranged from so many conversations. We need more conversations about the things they care about, the fundamentals. Right now, people do not feel their interests are being represented at the heart of decision making. They will be more attracted to centrist policies than they will be to extremist policies. And to me, the document the BCA put out, Seize the Moment, was a centrist manifesto. It was common sense, it should be grabbed by the centre, it should be promoted by the centre. I believe both political parties can operate with that agenda and the 6 shifts I've outlined. And I believe if they did and spent their political capital doing these things, rather than the endless political capital that is being spent on stuff-ups and scandals, leadership coups and endless wheel reinvention, the country would be in vastly better shape. The next fundamental I want to call out is policy process, and it has been very poor for a long time. It matters, it really matters. Gary Banks once mapped out the great policy catastrophes of Australia, and at the core of all of them was bad process. Whatever happened to green papers, to white papers, to bringing the community on important reform journeys? To improve the fundamentals of policy process, we need an environment, though, where ideas can flourish. We've got to end the merry-go-round of ruling things in and out, which has been going on for over a decade. We've got to end the stop-start approach to things like climate policy, industry policy and education policy, and accept that sometimes the previous government was doing the right thing. And we've got to be willing to let some ideas be floated and debated, not shut things down. Because reform takes a long time and it has to have lots of iterations. But we just can't seem to get traction in Australia because we will not allow debates to emerge and allow ideas to flourish. But the extreme end of not being able to have national debates is national intolerance. You can't get ideas generated, you cannot get processes to work properly, you cannot get things to happen if you cannot have respectful debate, if you do not live in a tolerant and inclusive society. And to me, the most fundamental challenge in this country is to regroup around tolerance and respect. Because right now, we are witnessing debates that lack civility, they lack truth, they lack respect, and they lack tolerance. We are not a country of haters. Hate does not belong in Australia, any form of hate. We cannot allow its venom to creep back into our society. We cannot turn a blind eye and bit by bit, decision by decision, allow hate to gain a foothold. And in that context, it would be remiss of me not to say something about corporate Australia and the voice. I believe corporate Australia did have the right to take a stand on the voice, and it had that right because it has led the way in creating employment and economic advancement opportunities for many Indigenous people. I believe the vast majority of Australians want Indigenous people to be better off. They want to see an end to chronic and systemic disadvantage. So we have to end the blame game about the referendum and commit ourselves to a decade of serious innovation and serious partnership with Indigenous people to move out of the language of deficit and into the language of potential. Because the worst outcome from the decision by the Australian people to vote against the referendum would be a sense of hopelessness now emerges in Indigenous communities, and a sense of reluctance to try new things creeps over policymakers. That would be unforgivable. So in conclusion, when I think about Tony Shepherd, I think about the most productive person in Australia. And in the same way, yeah, give him a clap. And in the same way, it's the fundamental stupid, it's the economy stupid, it's all about productivity. Everything I've talked about tonight is about productivity. So we can and we must take the steps to see us return to the fundamentals that will drive productivity, because without it, there can be no sustained economic growth. We can never forget we have an obligation to care and protect for the most vulnerable people in society. But you cannot give if you do not have. In Tony's honour, we must collectively return to a high productivity, high wage economy. Tony is the epitome of everything I've talked about tonight. He's driven projects, collaborated, turned things around. He's fundamentally decent. He's fundamentally pragmatic. He's fundamentally good-humoured and willing to have a laugh about himself. Haven't we lost that art? He's fundamentally respectful. He's fundamentally a centrist. And because of all of that, he fundamentally gets things done. So let's do what Tony would do and get back to the fundamentals. The fundamentals of how prosperity is driven, the fundamentals of how prosperity is shared, the fundamentals of a respectful, kind and decent society that people feel safe and happy to live in, and return to our fundamental obligation to leave each generation better off. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. And when we established the Shepherd Oration, that was exactly the sort of formulation and speech that we were hoping that we would see, because that is a framework for Australian success. And what I wanted to say about Jennifer is that Jennifer, like all of us, loves Australia, and Jennifer has spent so much of her life looking at the national interest, not any particular vested interest. And what you see is a coherent, patriotic framework for Australia to work through a lot of the issues that are so important today. So I just wanted to recognise the way that you've gone about your work professionally. You have given so much to Australia, and we are in your debt for your huge professional contribution. So I wanted to thank you very much for that. And finally, can I just say on a personal level, Jennifer, in describing Tony as a great Australian, is a great Australian herself and has shown people so much kindness while she's always been so industrious. So I just wanted to thank you very much. Now, that is the end of the formal proceedings, and we now invite you to stay, and I promise that next year we will get a much better MC. But thank you very much, and good evening.